Welcome to this rapid revision session looking at Red Cloud's War and the subsequent 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, not to be confused with the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, so be careful there. We're going to be looking at both of these things briefly, spending about 2 minutes on each, so it shouldn't be too long a video. Firstly, let's have a look at the basics around Red Cloud's War. You might want to do some extra reading on this, but the basics are as follows. Who was involved? Well, firstly, and quite obviously, Red Cloud, who was chief of the Lakota Sioux, versus the US Army, including a certain Captain Fetterman, who we'll come back to. What happened? Red Cloud fought to defend his land from white settlement, and the US Army, who were building forts on Sioux land without permission. Red Cloud lured Captain Fetterman of the US Army into a trap, and all 80 of his accompanying soldiers were killed by Sioux warriors in an ambush, which is depicted in the picture in the top right. This was the worst US defeat to Indians yet, and is known as Fetterman's Trap. Where did it take place? Well, as might be quite obvious, on Sioux land, but also it's related to the Bozeman Trail, which was a gold prospectors trail leading to the Montana goldfields, which crossed Indian land. This was something that the Plains Indians objected to. When did it happen? It happened between 1866 and 1868. Specifically, Fetterman's Trap occurred on the 21st of December in 1866. So why did it happen? The Sioux were angered by the number of white settlers who were trespassing on Sioux land by using the Bozeman Trail, which was established following the discovery of gold in Montana in 1858. Red Cloud had arranged to meet with the US government, but instead launched a war on discovering that the US Army were already building forts on Sioux land without permission. So what's the specific detail in terms of importance and outcomes? Well, the US government was shocked by Fetterman's defeat, and actually, after a period of fighting, agreed to discuss peace terms. This led to the second Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. And we're going to take some time to look in detail at what was agreed at that treaty, and actually what it led to. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. In basic terms, in this treaty, the Indians agreed to have Red Cloud lead his people back to the Sioux reservation. They also agreed to never leave the reservation again. These points established the Great Sioux Reservation. They also agreed not to attack US Army or settlers. They agreed to sign the treaty, although Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, two significant warrior leaders, refused to sign it, and that would have consequences later on. On the US government side, the US government agreed to close the Bozeman Trail and prevent unauthorized white settlement of Sioux land, and to leave the Black Hills to the Sioux in perpetuity, which means forever, as a sacred site. And that's important. The Black Hills were the most important sacred site to the Sioux. But let's just have a quick look at this table here. It's pretty obvious that the US government is not agreeing to as much as the Indians are agreeing. So let's consider the consequences. In the American West exam, you might find that you have a question that asks you for the consequences of a particular event. It's one thing to know the terms of the treaty. It's another thing to know what happens next and to link the two. The treaty wasn't all it seemed. So yes, Red Cloud did lead his people back to the Sioux reservation, but some refused to go. They also agreed to never leave the reservation again, but they followed the buffalo to hunt. After all, the buffalo were not going to be respecting the borders of a reservation. They agreed not to attack the US Army or settlers, but conflict still happened. And although they signed the treaty, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse's refusal to do so led to war and ultimately the Battle of the Little Big Horn in 1876. So we can see here some of the consequences. But what about the US government side? The US government did indeed close the Bozeman Trail, but it was a bit of a con. Other routes existed and a railroad was built in the Black Hills. I mean, that's a seriously disrespectful thing to do. I suppose for an English person that might be comparing to building Crossrail straight through St Paul's Cathedral. It's just a ridiculous idea. It's a very important holy site and that would be an enormous desecration. But that's what the US government did anyway, despite the assurances to leave the Black Hills to the Sioux. Also, they did agree to leave the Black Hills, like I say, but a railroad was built and in the process gold and prospectors followed. When gold was discovered, really the US government tore up all of these agreements. They offered to buy the land from the Sioux, but really the Sioux weren't interested in having money in return for their most sacred site. They were interested in having that sacred site. So when the prospectors followed in 1874, they required army protection. And who do you think was there? You've guessed it, George Armstrong Custer. And that sets the scene for the Battle of the Little Bighorn as well. But I'll cover that in a separate video. Some final points then. Red Cloud struck back against the US Army and government because they'd gone back on earlier agreements regarding the migrant trails and forts on his land. Red Cloud achieved many of his aims, and the war ended with the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. However, not all of the Lakota agreed to the settlement, and significantly, the scene was now set for further conflict, which I'll cover in further and later rapid revision videos. But for now, that'll be the end of this one. I hope it's been useful to you, and if it has, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you've got a topic that you're desperate for me to do a rapid revision video on, pop it in the comments below and I'll see what I can do. But for now, I'll say thanks very much for watching and goodbye.